Chapter 10. Steel Feather. They came to a long passage where the ceiling was supported by columns studded with semi-precious stones. At the end waited a squad of determined-looking soldiers. Half bore small, double-curved bows, the rest long-bladed pikes. She held up a hand. Her army stopped. "I wish you no harm," she called, "but I want the Emperor. Give him to me or get out of my way, but choose." "We will defend our Emperor to the death," cried one. "That's fair foolish. My friends are a bit hard to kill. They've been dead already." One of them fired. His hand shook so much that the arrow flew wide. "Witch!" a man screamed. "Sorceress!" Did they think names mattered anymore? "For the last time, get out of my way." They did not move. She waved. The spiked three-horn came up and lowered his head, the spines on his neck frill like rays of the sun. 5 armored lizards stumped into place behind him. A wedge formed, the skeletons headed for the guards. Arrows flew. Those that struck their targets shattered. The rest could as well have been rain. The pikemen lunged to find their weapons gripped in bony jaws and wrenched from their grasp. Those still on their feet ran. 3 lay on the floor after being knocked down. The armored lizards nudged them out of the way. Impatient, the spiked three-horn rammed the door. It shattered. Orange fire billowed out of the room. The skeletal creature exploded into a million fragments. The armored lizards opened their jaws in what Dane knew was a silent roar and charged. Orange fire ripped the side off a double-armored lizard and broke the right side spines on its neighbor. The remaining skeletons kept going. Dane covered her eyes against a bright flare of magic beyond the door, then urged her mammoth forward. Inside the doorway, Chioke lay crushed. He was pinned there by a 33-foot-long armored forest lizard, whose skull and front half were melting. Dane slid down and went to the dinosaur, trying not to cry as it fought to look at her. "Go back to sleep," she said, patting the undamaged spine. "You've done a wondrous thing here, and I thank you. Go back to sleep." The dinosaur relaxed, letting what remained of his head drift to the floor. For a moment copper fire shone brightly in the girl's eyes, running along her friend's bones. In it she saw the forest lizard as he must have looked in life, skin a gleaming chestnut brown, all his spines and plates whole. He was trotting away from her, bound for a lush forest that shone in the distance. When her vision cleared, even his skeleton was gone. Checking the pair who had been half destroyed outside the door, she saw that they too had vanished. A snake neck grabbed her by the waistband and lifted her onto the mammoth's back. "Please be careful about getting down," scolded Zek. "Even if we fight the ones with magic, you are safer up here." The mammoth waited for the last of the skeletons to enter Ozorn's rooms, then followed. 2 snake necks, finding that they would never get their large bones through the door, began to lean against the walls, trying to force them. "Emperor Ozorn!" shouted Dane. No one answered. The girl looked at her warriors. "I think you'd best go to work." They ripped the elaborate suite of rooms to shreds. They tore open chests and closets, broke whatever could be broken, furnishings, tiles, glass, pottery. The secret exit through which Zek had seen Ozorn go to visit a captive girl was laid bare. Dane urged her mammoth through the different chambers until they passed through Ozorn's bedroom and entered the aviary. Here were the benches, and the table where he'd fed her dream rose. A book lay open on it, and a decanter of wine had shattered on the floor. Someone had been here recently, and had left in a hurry. Looking around, she saw that the panes of the rear wall had been shattered, as though a giant fist had punched through the glass and its green metal fittings. Soot streaked the panes on the outside. The odor of scorched bone hung in the air. More than ever, she was glad she had arranged for the birds to be taken away before any of this began. Her mammoth followed the tyrant lizard through the broken wall and into the gardens. Here lay some of the warriors from another part of her army, a 4-toothed elephant, 2 plated lizards, and a snake neck. Their remains were blackened and twisted by magical fire. "Thank you," she whispered to all of them. Copper fire bloomed, scorched bones rose and became whole bodies. The dinosaurs headed toward a distant forest, to vanish as the copper light faded. "Curse it," she muttered, looking at the burned area where they had lain. "Curse it! Curse it!" She pounded the mammoth's back in fury. Where had Ozorn gone, if indeed he was the one who had done this? He could be anywhere, up to any kind of mischief. A small winged shape with long leathery ears dropped a flutter before her nose, squeaking a welcome. This was a large, mouse-eared bat on his night's hunt for insects. He was glad to see her, he said. All kinds of strange things were going on tonight. Was there anything he and his colony of the people could do? Zek eyed him suspiciously. Can they be of any use? He asked. One way to find out, she replied with a grim smile. Cradling the bat against her shirt, she called the others, both mouse-eared bats and common pipistrelles. The ones close by came to Dane herself, gripping her clothes or lighting on the mammoth's wide back. Those bats within the range of her magic, but not close enough to reach her in person, found roosts and waited to hear what she had to say. As Zek peered curiously at these new guests, Dane built for them an image of Ozorn as he would look to bats, his face and form drawn with sound, not light. She gave them everything, from the tinny echo of beads in his hair to the clear whispers that would return from his gems. Can you hear him? She asked. Is he anywhere near you? Wait, they told her in a single voice, and took to the air. As the rest of her third of the skeleton army caught up, Ozorn's chambers now so much rubble, she wondered what to do if the bats were unsuccessful. They could find him outdoors, even if he were invisible. No cloaking spell was invulnerable to sound. If he were indoors, or wore another shape, that was a different matter. They would recognize the form, not the wearer. If he couldn't defeat the dinosaurs, would he run? It was hard to imagine the Emperor mage running from a girl and her army of dead animals. Still, blasts like the one that had finished the dinosaurs outside the aviary had to be costly in terms of his magical strength. Reports began to come back from her spies. Bats were fast in the air, and they built sound pictures quickly. Within minutes, Dane knew that not only was the Emperor nowhere in the gardens, towers, or outlying buildings, but the parts of the complex were in flames. Pull back then, all of you, she said, wanting to cry. It's no good you getting cooked. Maybe we can help, a voice said from behind her. Dane turned and gasped. The hyenas were out. How? What? She stammered. Tiu, the boss female, came forward to sniff Dane's mammoth. The mistress let us out, she said. Old One-Eye. She is a goddess of two-leggers, but she helps us too, now and then. Light reflected from metal in the air. Rakosh landed on a balcony nearby. I believe she felt you would require assistance, drawled the green-eyed Stormwing. You might want to know, a company of dinosaur skeletons opened the menagerie cages and dumped trees into the pit so the animals could climb out. Kitten? She asked Rakosh. My dragon? I dreamed she was in the Immortals' menagerie. You dream truly. She is there under a sleep spell, he replied. Your friends tried to break into that collection, but failed. The spells on the gate and cages are keyed to Ozorn. They won't give way until he dies. We are going to find this Ozorn, Tiu said cheerfully. The mistress reminded us. We have a score to settle. She said you might want to come too. Dane thought fast. A hyena's sense of smell was keener than any other living creature she'd ever met. She was willing to bet Ozorn wouldn't think to change the unique scent given off by his body, no matter what shape he took. Better still, Tiu and her boys, Iri and Aran, were creatures Ozorn had reason to fear. What better hunters could a girl bent on vengeance ask for? Lift me down, please, she asked the mammoth, who complied. On the ground once more, she looked at Tiu. I want to shapeshift and become one of you. Then we can hunt the Emperor together, if you're willing. Tiu gave a strange-sounding yip, a hyena laugh. Get on with it, the hyena urged. The night is young, and Ozorn has a head start. Dane looked up at Rakosh. It just occurred to me. What in the name of all the horse lords are you doing here? The Stormwing ruffled his feathers. I was paying my respects to my true sovereign, Queen Barza, and her consort. Rakosh, she said warningly, not believing him. Well, as it happens, I'd heard that tonight would be an interesting night for Karthik. You mean the graveyard hag told you? Perhaps. The Stormwing's eyes glittered as he smiled. There's a chance the Emperor might feel the need to use the gift that I gave him. I wanted to be here to see the fun. If he has any sense, he's run off. Ah, but a man with sense never would have ignored so many warnings. I doubt he has fled. He killed Numr, Dane said hoarsely. I know. The immortal rocked to and fro, cleared his throat, and said, I am sorry. Me too, she whispered. She rubbed her sleeve over her eyes and turned to her skeleton army. Will you go on tearing things up? I don't know if you can follow where I'm about to go, and I really want to leave this place a ruin. All of them nodded. Zek clambered down from the mammoth's back. She patted each skeleton and elephant as they passed her, wishing them a good hunt and giving them her thanks. When they had gone, she asked Rakash, Would you look after Zek and see he comes to no harm? He frowned, but nodded. If he does not object, I will place him in the dragon's cage. He jumped to the ground, using outspread wings to slow his fall. It will be good to see Kitten, Zek said, even if she's asleep. I'd hate for anything to happen to Zek, Dane said quietly, meeting Rakash's eyes with hers. My throat knows why, but I trust you. She kissed the top of the marmoset's head, then held him out to the Stormwing. Zek climbed over Rakash's shoulder, where steel grew out of flesh, and hid under the Stormwing's long hair, grasping handfuls of it. He smells terrible, the marmoset confided to Dane. Good hunting, Rakash said, and took flight. Before he and Zek had gone from sight, Dane began the painstaking business of entering hyena form. She drew her memories of Tiyu's mind around her, letting her body shift. Her jaw spread and lengthened to become a muzzle. Her teeth broadened, widened, sharpened. At last she sat on the stone of the courtyard, a spotted hyena. We can pick up the scent inside, she told her companions. His rooms are through that hole in the glass. Tiyu grinned, showing bone-crushing teeth. By all means, let us get a whiff of his lair. Dane and the males grinned back. The dinosaurs still at work inside paid no attention to the 4 hyenas sniffing the Emperor's bedclothes and garments. The reek of Ozorn's many perfumes made Dane feel queasy. Smells that had been almost too much for her as a human were far more powerful to a hyena's nose. I don't see why he soaks himself in all this, Irie complained. It's disgusting. Don't whine, ordered Tiyu. You should be grateful he left such a clear trail for us. As they followed the scent through shattered glass to the outside once more, Dane found changes in it. Bitter tones, more powerful even than the perfumes, lingered around his steps. Outside, where smells of burned ground and scorched bone filled her nose, she could still find those bitter traces. The hyenas snuffled the earth, their nostrils taking information from the odors there. Dane growled, her rage surfacing at last as a hunter's eagerness to find her prey. Got it? Aran asked. She realized she would know Ozorn's scent for the rest of her life, perhaps even in human form. Got it, she replied. Then let's go, Tiyu said. The hyenas picked up the trail along the outside wall of this wing of the palace. Tiyu led the way, Dane at her side. The males spread out behind them, chattering in yips and whines. What are those bad smells in his spoor? Dane asked the female. The ones that came from his odor as he left his rooms. Tiyu bared her teeth in a laugh. Fear, she replied gleefully. Your friends chased him from his lair and into the dark, on foot. Those are fear scents in your nose. If he were a wildebeest with that smell, you'd know it was beaten and you were about to make a nice kill. They stopped at a fresh battlefield. A dead human in armor lay against the wall. He'd dragged himself away from the mammoth that had crushed his lower body. The mammoth itself was a pile of embers that burned copper and vanished when Dane pawed at it, whining. 2 more skeletons nearby had been crisped by magical fire. They vanished like the mammoth's remains when she touched them with her paw. A red-robed mage lay moaning in the bushes where he'd been thrown. Come on, Irie called to Dane. The trail will get cold. They found 2 more sites where the Emperor Mage had been forced to defend himself. There were so many bodies at the second, 7 in all, that Dane thought of the sacrifices demanded at the funerals of ancient kings, whose households were put to death so that the king might have attendants in the afterlife. Carefully she thanked each of the fallen dinosaurs and elephants that had died a second time for her, and watched as their remains vanished from sight before moving on. Next the trail brought them around a corner and into the light. At the end of a short mall ahead, the palace was ablaze. Between the hyenas and the fire stood a squad of armed guards. One of them yelped, seeing the beasts, and brought up a loaded crossbow. Aran leaped, strong legs propelling him across the distance between them, and tore the weapon from the guard's hand. Bats swarmed out of the dark, blinding the other men with their wings before they could shoot the attacking hyena. Snarling, Aran crushed the bow staff, making the weapon unusable. The rest of the guards dropped their weapons and fled. The hyenas moved on. The night air carried 1,000 messages. Dane ignored the unimportant ones and concentrated on the odor of her prey. The Emperor's scent changed as they followed, as if it were a living thing that grew under her eyes. In his rooms, it had been one of a very well-tended man, tinged with almond rubbing oil, aloe lotion, orris-scented shampoo, perfumed makeup, the acrid smell of gilding powder and gold, lavender from his clothes, and the personal scent of a man who ate and drank richly. In the aviary, anger and then fear had been added to the mix. Outside, he'd acquired a touch of charred hair and bone. Now the smell of burned things was much thicker. So was the fear. Thunder rolled overhead. Flagstones gave way to gravel as the hyenas followed a path between tall hedges. The smell of recent burning drifted into their faces. 3 dinosaur skeletons must have come at Ozorn from the far end of the path. Their blackened remains lay in a heap there. The Emperor had fled through an opening in the hedge. Stopping to thank those fallen allies, Dane trembled. He'd escaped her army again. A growl rumbled in her throat and her mane stood up. He's weakening, remarked Tiu as the heaped skeleton shimmered and vanished. All the bones of the others were black through and through. These had white in them, and they still held together instead of breaking apart. Good, snarled Dane. The less magic he has, the better. The hyenas yipped agreement and picked up the Emperor's trail, laced now with blood and sweat. His thin shoes had given out on the gravel, leaving footprints etched in blood. Their path twisted around a fountain, followed the curve of the artificial lake, and headed straight down a path shaded by willows. Here the great three-horn, the first dinosaur she had awakened, and a huge snake-neck must have been waiting for him. The snake-neck was the first they'd seen who bore few marks of burning. Instead, tiny cracks had riddled its bones. Some had disintegrated completely, leaving small powdery heaps. When Dane nudged its skull, the skeleton shaped itself, becoming a living dinosaur. The snake-neck waited patiently while the girl turned to the three-horn. Ozor had tried to burn him without success, then melted him the way Chioke had melted the bull three-horn. The great skeleton had gone down fighting. Blood painted the tip of a long, sharp brow horn. Dane sniffed it. The blood was Ozorn's. He's running out of fire, Irie told the others with savage glee. Look at this one, barely charred. Sadly, Dane licked the three-horn's beak. It gave under her tongue as flesh might. Why are you unhappy? Tiu wanted to know. Does it hurt them to die? No, Dane replied softly as copper fire raced over the half-melted skeleton, calling the owner back to the true shape of its living days. The badger said it didn't, anyway. It just hurts me. The great three-horn stood, his beaded hide a deep golden bronze, his face with its horns restored. Through him Dane could see the trees dimly. Goodbye, she said, though she knew he couldn't hear. I'll miss you. The three-horn bowed his head, touching her gently with his nose horn, then followed the snake-neck down a road to a distant jungle. The vision faded as they left the hyenas, until only the garden trees were left. Rage and sorrow built in Dane's heart until she thought it might burst. I want Ozorn, she snarled at her companions. I want to rip him up like he's ripped me up. Then hunt, cried the hyenas, eerie voices echoing in the dark. Smell and find. Dane set off, nose to the ground, the others behind her. Ozorn's scent was nearly fresh and thick with the sourness of exhaustion. Drops of sweat had fallen with his blood, the red liquid dripping heavily now that the three-horn had marked him. The trail turned beside a wall and passed through the shattered gates of the menagerie. Inside the mortal animals' enclosure, no animals were left. The cages were open, the fences pulled down, and trees reached from the pits to the ground level. The gate of the Immortals' menagerie stood open and whole. Someone who knew the spells had unlocked it. He's here, she cried, and leaped. Kadar stood before the griffin's cage, hand upraised. At the hyena's snarl he whirled, and the shape he wore evaporated. It was Ozorn. The moment he spotted her and the others, the reek of fear almost wiped out his other smells. He was disheveled, sweat-soaked, bleeding, soot-streaked. He wore only a light green robe and costly shredded slippers. The fabric over his chest was torn. Beneath lay a long open wound that still bled sluggishly. "He's trying to escape on the griffin, I bet," Dane told her companions. "He can think again." She sprang and hit the Emperor's magical shield head first, making it flare briefly. She howled, barely noticing the pain of a bruised head and neck as she dropped. Far more important than pain was the fact that the magical shield had weakened a hair when she struck it. Tiu and Aran leaped and hit the barrier, sparking twin flares in it. They fell, snarling in fury. Dane, watching, saw that the flares weren't as bright as when she'd hit. Irie attacked from Ozorn's left. This time the Emperor's shield only flickered from the impact. It still held firm, but he was losing strength. The caged immortals watched silently. Emerald fire gathered slowly around Ozorn's hands. He swayed as it grew. There was a white-hot edge to its glow, the kind that left a streaky imprint on eyes that watched it too long. The hyenas circled to the man's left and right, yipping with excitement. Dane stayed in front of him, teeth bared, mane erect. "One more blow should do it," she told the others. "One more, and he's ours." "No!" cried a human voice behind her. Sparkling fire leaped through the air to form a bubble around the Emperor. Dane snarled without looking away from her quarry. How dare two-leggers cheat her of what she had won? She threw herself against the new fire barrier and received a nasty shock on her delicate nose. "You'll have to choose, Uncle." This voice was different from the one that had cried, "No." Abdication and imprisonment, or the hyenas? You must give in. Your gift is almost used up. We can see you're taking it from your own life force now. Ozorn's fire had evaporated. He swayed, his skin gone cheesy white under streaked facial paint. Never! His voice was hoarse with effort. "Then it must be the hyenas, Uncle, just as the graveyard hag promised." "Give him to the animals!" cried the female Stormwing Barza. "They have worked hard for his flesh. Let them have it. Let them feast, so we can sup on his fear." The Emperor stared at the female immortal in open terror. Dane, Tiu, Aran, and Irie cried their triumph in a series of hollow yips that made Ozorn shudder. Dane stalked up to the sparkling barrier, intent on the man inside. "You're mine," she thought, and bared white, bone-crushing teeth. "For Numr, you're mine." Ozorn's eyes brightened feverishly. "Promises, is it? Well, I have a promise in reserve." He grabbed the hair on the back of his head, fumbling among its strands. A rattle of steel made Dane glance to the side. Barza and Hebek were at the bars of their cage, staring at the Emperor Mage with grim concentration. Above them, on the roof of their prison, Rakash had also come to watch. "See!" Ozorn cried. Dane's head whipped around. The Emperor held a metal feather, the one Rakash had given him, pulled from a braided strand of hair. "I have this promise!" She snarled in fury and threw herself at the barrier as Ozorn drove the feather through his arm. Something exploded in a burst of light. Dane, falling through a vanishing barrier, slammed into metal that cut. She rolled away and struggled to her feet. A Stormwing with Ozorn's face and hair stood where he had just been. Steel feathers and talons gleamed as if newly minted. The gash on his chest was now a clean, broad scar. Chimes filled the air. One after another, the cages disappeared, releasing the inhabitants. The griffins and Huroks wasted no time. They fled into the night sky, filling Dane's ears with the sound of flapping wings. Magic of a deep gray shade, almost like fog, washed and wrapped itself around the killer unicorns, spidrins, and killer centaurs, holding them where they were, as the more peaceful centaurs fled. Kitten, in a cage at the far end of the courtyard, sat up with an inquiring cheep. Zek clambered up her back to perch on her shoulder. The cold fangs looked around, tongues sliding out to taste the breeze. Barza and Hebek stretched their wings in a slow, ominous movement, exercising each feather. "Humans, stay out of this," commanded the Queen. "Now he is in our form. He must answer to Stormwing justice." Ozorn gaped in horror. "No! I am the Emperor Mage, Lord of Karthik." "No immortal may hold a mortal throne," Hebek said, rocking to and fro. "Wake up, Emperor Mage. Do you understand now the trap that was laid for you? No immortal may rule over humans or use human magic. Rakosh had drifted gently to earth, wings outstretched, when the Stormwing cage vanished under him. Now he stood behind his queen and her consort, razor-sharp teeth bared in a nasty grin. Go ahead. Try it. Osborne croaked a word. Something boomed, and he went flying end over end, as if blown by a powerful wind. He smashed into the menagerie's rear wall and lay stunned. You forgot our earliest lessons, Osborne, said a voice behind Dane. It struck a chord in her memory, but if her life had depended on it, she couldn't have looked away from the drama taking place before her nose. Once you take immortal shape, you can never change back. We are free, cried Barza in triumph. First I take payment from that motherless worm Jacone, and then I will tend to you, Osborne. She took to the air, Hebek behind her. Osborne screamed and struggled to stand up on his awkward new claws. I have magic! I have Stormwing magic! Of course you do, sweetheart, Rakosh said pleasantly. Do you know how to use it? A scarlet bolt edged with gold struck from overhead, to blow a hole in front of Osborne. For a moment he stood there, panting, mouth working as he tried to speak. Sweat rolled off him. You'll get the hang of it in a few days or so, Rakosh told him with false sympathy. If you live that long, of course. There is a reason the former King Jacone didn't want to fight Barza Razorwing on her terms. A second bolt struck the flagstones behind the new Stormwing, spraying him with sharp fragments. Osborne cursed blackly, then leaped, pumping his wings clumsily. For a moment he dropped. At last he began to rise, bit by slow bit. Everyone watched as he climbed into the darkness overhead. Rakosh sighed. I wouldn't like him to lose interest, not after it took so much work to get him into the proper claws. Barza will want him eventually, after all. He looked at the hyenas. Is one of you Dane? The girl trotted over to the edge of the dais that had once been a Stormwing cage. Rakosh waddled over to look down at her. If it counts for anything, though I'm not sure that it does, you have my gratitude. And things aren't as bad as you think. You might look around. He took flight and sped away, calling, Osborne, my precious, where are you? The hyenas gathered around Dane. What did that mean? Asked Tiu. Look around for what? I don't know, the girl replied, turning to find the human mages behind her. Kadar was standing by the griffin's empty cage. Lyndal, Bone Dancer on his shoulder, was keeping the killer centaurs, spidrins, and killer unicorns penned with his fog-colored magic. In the gateway stood Numr Solomon. Dane gasped and lost her grip on the hyena shape. She turned human instantly, human and unclothed, and sat down hard. No, she whispered, breathless. Gods, this is too horrible. Don't do this to me. The hyenas shifted to form a circle of furry bodies, concealing her as the man came forward. I'm real, sweetling. It truly is me. Kadar and Varys saw them kill you. You're a ghost, or a puppet. A Simuth thing. He lifted a hand. Black sparkling fire grew around it. Osborne couldn't attach magic to a simulacrum, remember? He let the fire die as the hyenas watched, heads cocked in interest. She swallowed. Very well, then, you're one of Numr's simulacra. Magelet, remember how we met? I was a shape-shifted hawk. You nursed me until Alana helped me regain my true form. Last year in the courtyard of Dunlath Castle, I changed Tristan Staghorn into an apple tree with a word of power. He removed his cloak and tossed it toward her. Borne by his magic, it settled onto Dane. Rising, she wrapped the cloth around her with numb fingers. She didn't think a fake would know so much. Gingerly she stepped away from the hyenas and reached for him, then yanked back, terrified that if she touched him, she would know he was dead. Kitten? She cried. Is it really him? The dragon chortled happily and nodded. Numr waited, one hand extended to her. Steeling herself, she reached again and placed her hand in his. Roughly he pulled her into an enveloping hug, arms encircling and lifting her off her feet. Nose buried in his shirt, she breathed his unique smell, one of spices, soap, and clean clothes. No one would think to copy that, she realized, and began to cry. He murmured softly to her, arms wonderfully tight. When at last she stopped, he let her go and produced a handkerchief. Obediently she wiped her eyes and blew her nose. "Where have you been?" "At the university. Once the Emperor's men arrested my simulacrum, I had to play least in sight for a day or two." "But they knew. Varys and Kadar were sure it was you." "It was a very good simulacrum, my dear. I worked on it for weeks in secret and had it shipped to Lyndal from Tyra. I didn't quite trust Osborne's good intentions, I'm afraid." Memory flared. In Lyndal's office, Lyndal had placed the turtle in another room, and she had seen a shape like a body covered with cloth. "Why didn't you tell me?" Numr sighed and smiled ruefully down at her. "I have no idea. I think I forgot." "Oh." That made more sense than it didn't. "How'd you find out about all this, then?" "Kadar made it across the river. We have enjoyed a most informative evening. Are you aware that the entire West Wing and Astronomer's Tower are burning?" She scuffed a foot on the ground. "I thought they'd killed you. I lost my temper." Numr's eyes danced. "Magelet, that is the greatest understatement I have heard in my life." "She had help," said a cracked female voice. "She couldn't have done it without me." The graveyard hag had appeared at the back of the Immortals' enclosure, cane, eye patch, and all. The badger waddled at her side. "That's true enough," Dane snapped. She hadn't forgotten her anger with the goddess. "But if you'd done what you're supposed to, none of this would have been necessary. And I told you we have rules." As she passed the Coldfangs, they slid their tongues out, tasting her cape. "Oh, go away, you," the goddess ordered. Silverlight gathered around the Coldfangs, and they were gone. "You too," she said, pointing at the Spidrins, then at the killer centaurs and unicorns with her cane. "I'll talk to you when I get back." Silverfire gathered, and they vanished. "Interesting company you keep these days," Numr told the badger as Dane stifled a yawn. "If I'd had a choice, I would have given up the experience," was the grumbled reply. "You did very well, Kit," he told Dane. She smiled at him. "Thank you, Badger. Coming from you, it means a lot." The graveyard hag came over to Dane. "Well, dearie, it's been fun, but you have something of mine, and I want it back." Numr put a protective arm around Dane's shoulders. "She doesn't have anything of yours, goddess. Does she?" "Bringing the dead animals back," Dane said, yawning. "That part's hers. You can have it," she said, extending a hand to the goddess. "It makes me nervous." The hag wrapped a gnarled hand around Dane's. White light blazed and vanished. Suddenly the girl's knees felt rubbery. She swayed and Numr caught her. Kitten, who had managed to leap down from the platform of her former cage with Zek on her back, trotted over, whistling angrily at the goddess while her scales turned pink. "Oh, stop it," chided the graveyard hag. "She's just a bit tired. It's only to be expected." "Goddess, will you listen to me for a moment?" They had forgotten the Kadar was also there. When they turned to look at him, he went down on one knee. "Please?" The hag grinned cheerfully and leaned on her gnarled stick. "What have you got for me, handsome?" "Gracious lady, my uncle's palace is shambles, its treasure burning or scattered or buried. His chief mage is dead, as are many of those mages who supported him. There are people of goodwill in this realm, people who feared to cross my uncle while he ruled. I know the gods are angry, but please, will you stay your hand from more destruction? Intercede for us before Mithros' court? Give us a chance to prove our worth. I represent a secret fellowship of nobles, academics, and merchants who genuinely wish things to change here. Karthik is not beyond hope." Lyndal bowed deeply to Kadar. "Your Imperial Majesty," he said. "So he is," remarked Numr, and bowed. Dane, after a moment's hesitation, copied them, yawning. When she straightened, the hag fixed the girl with her one good eye. "What do you recommend? Seems to me, since you did the hard work, you ought to have a say." "Give him the chance," Dane said, fighting yet another yawn. "Prince, Emperor Kadar, I suppose. He cares about the land and the people. If you gods were only interested in destroying the Empire, not saving it, you wouldn't have waited to use me. You'd have gotten on with it." The graveyard hag grinned and looked at the badger. You were right about her, she said. Sharp as a shang blade, she is. Looking up, she said, Well, my brothers and sisters, what do you think? I say let's give him the benefit of a doubt. For a moment nothing happened. Then a rich wind filled with the scent of growing things filled the air. Overhead, thunder boomed again, a long, rolling crash that seemed to peal forever. When it ended, rain poured down in sheets, drenching everyone. Very good, the graveyard hag said with approval. Gripping her cane, she stumped over to the new emperor. Get up, she commanded. Silly for a ruler to kneel in a cloudburst. Kadar obeyed, looking dazed. I hope your memory is better than Ozorn's, sonny, she informed him. I won't be ignored, not in my own empire. Now give me your arm. We need to talk. The young man swallowed and offered his arm to the goddess with a courteous bow. She took it, cackling. That's more like it, she said, leading him toward the gate. Now don't worry about the army and the guard. They were told to stay put or they'd risk the gods' wrath if they came to help your uncle tonight. By dawn they'll be ready to go to work. Oh, wait. She looked back over her shoulder. Aram or Numr, whatever you call yourself, put that girl to bed. She'll sleep for 3 days, give or take. To Kadar, she said, Where was I? Now, I like fresh flowers in my temples, and no more cheap pine incense. Her voice faded as they walked off into the gardens. 3 days? Numr asked, looking at Dane with concern. It was divine power moving through her, said the badger. Dane found that talk was too much work just now, as was standing. She sat and smiled up at Numr. Sleep is all she needs. She smiled agreement, then hugged Kitten and a deeply unhappy, wet Zek. Don't worry about the escaped menagerie animals. The badger's voice was the last thing she would remember as she closed her eyes. We animal gods will see to it that they reach their proper homes unhurt. It is the least we can do.